Welcome this evening, ladies and gentlemen, to this event which we're absolutely delighted to host. We're doing this on behalf of the Baltic Geopolitics programme. There are copies of our brochure here, which by all means pick up later on. And it's one in a long series of events, some online, some in person, some in the UK, some internationally, which we've run since we were established in January 2021. We're an organisation which seeks to focus on the whole Baltic Sea region, on the UK-Baltic relationship, which is very profound, on the importance of history in understanding current geopolitics. We would say that it's not possible properly to understand the geopolitical problems of the moment without understanding the historical background. Fourthly, we welcome the participation of academics, but also of practitioners, meaning diplomats, military people, politicians, business, and so on. And finally, we like to look at any aspect of concern, but we always look at the geopolitical dimension of it. If you look on in this brochure, you'll find our website. We very much welcome your participation in our organisations. Please sign up in order to receive notification of our meetings and our activities. It is co-led, this programme, by Professor Brendan Sims, who's the inspiring genius behind this, and myself. And we find ourselves in an effective and sometimes creative tension relationship between the true academic and the low practitioner in how we should organise things and carry things through. We're delighted that Donatas Kupciunas, who's sitting here at the front, is our research fellow who's been extremely vital to enable us to move forward in a variety of different ways. Welcome to this event this evening. So this evening we're going to start in just a second, and Henrik, who I'll introduce in a moment, will introduce his book, Mannerheim, Marshal of Finland, and he will talk for about 25 minutes. And we will then have questions and answers and discussion between all of us until about 6:30, after which there are very attractive drinks at the back, which we hope will seduce you to continue the conversation in a very relaxed way. Henrik and I had a nice afternoon walking around Cambridge, and we've talked about the relative tendencies of the Brits and the Finns to use alcohol to facilitate their social dialogues. But this is a practical working experiment we're about to have at 6:30 today to see how it goes. We're absolutely delighted that Henrik has come from Helsinki to join us today. He first involved himself in one of our activities when last May we had a session in Helsinki, in the British Ambassador's residence in Helsinki, about the historic relationships between the UK and Finland. And Henrik was one of the key speakers in this event because, of course, the British-Finnish relationship is a very interesting one, really over centuries, and we wanted to try and explore that. And so we followed up when we heard that his biography of Mannerheim was to be published in English, by thinking it would be a very good idea to have a small event here to explore those relationships more fully. He is a very distinguished historian of Finland. He has published A History of Finland, which is a bestseller and really helps form the narrative of the story of Finland today. And in fact, this book goes over the period when Finland became an independent country at the end of the First World War, which is actually a subject which we discussed in a big symposium here in Cambridge in March this year, when we looked at the independence of Finland, the three Baltic states, and the second independence of Poland, and how those all arose at that time. Mannerheim was an enormous figure in the history of the country, a very controversial figure, a difficult figure, and I believe that Henrik's biography of him will help provide a background to understand who he was and how he operated and what kind of role he played, not only in the history of modern Finland, but in a sense even more importantly, the history of the Baltic more widely. And we're absolutely delighted, Henrik, that you've been ready to come today and introduce this. And I very much look forward to what you're going to say. So let's just welcome Henrik, and thank you very much for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a true pleasure for me to to stand here and launch the biography of Mannerheim, that one has to emphasize also the background of it. In my early, career in 1990s, I functioned as curator of the Mannerheim Museum, and that was directly after the Cold War had ended. So I really, as a young scholar, only then understood how much emotions Mannheim actually evoked, both positive but also negative. And then gradually it all ended up in a publisher convincing me that it was time now to write a biography of Mannheim. It is important to emphasize that there has been written a number of biographies of Mannheim. The most monumental of them is a Swedish historian, Stig Jägerskiöld, who wrote a biography, 8-volume biography. So it is impossible. It would have been impossible to translate it, and it was actually was not in line with modern research, especially not Finnish research, for a simple reason that he did not really master Finnish language. Then there was a very also high standard biography written by your compatriot John Screen in 2 volumes. One, the first already published in 1970, and the second in year of 2000. Of those 2, the first is actually better. The name of that part is The Years of Preparation, because Mannerheim served for 30 years in the Russian Imperial Army. And since then, of course, a number of other biographies have been published. In the year of 2017, actually 4 or 5 biographies were published, and this was originally published in Swedish and Finnish, being my both mother tongues, one could say. Swedish was Mannerheim's mother tongue, but because he served in the Russian army for 30 years, Russian language was important, but even more important was French, because of that was the court language and the aristocratic language. Now I will try to focus both on geopolitics and the individual Mannerheim, and we will see how I cope with it in 25 minutes, because they are both pretty large subjects. This is just I hope you see, at least you understand, it's a question of, it's the Russian railway network between 1890s and 1919 that really then describes how Finland was connected to the empire. Finland had been joined to the Russian Empire during Napoleonic Wars and remained a Grand Duchy up until the Russian Revolution in 1917. So the railways connected Finland really to the empire, to the expanding empire up until the early 20th century. But at the same time, also Finland developed in a western direction through trade, but especially through the roots of the society. One could say Finland is a Swedish society where we speak Finnish and some Swedish as well. But then geopolitically, Finland has been both a part of the Western buffer zone or then the Eastern buffer zone. And in 19th century, Finland was, of course, a Russian buffer zone, which then, of course, caused that Finland was dragged into the First World War in the last stage of that war in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. Mannerheim traveled a lot along those railways. Actually, the wars that he took part in the Russian-Japanese War, First World War, Russian Revolution, and then in Finland we actually speak about 3 wars during the Second World War, which is typical for us Finns, that we give the wars that we are dragged into, we give them their own names, which is in a way an attempt to describe Finland as a political subject in history, which it actually has not always been, or pretty seldom actually. Now, of course, Mannerheim traveled also through Russian Empire up until the ocean and up until Manchuria, because he took part in the Russian-Japanese War. Actually, was pretty successful in that. And then some short, lines about his. I mean, I could of course have delivered this to the publishers, but that would not have been a book. His background was he's rooted in a Swedish and then later Finnish high aristocracy family, and after some stumbling in his early career, he then was rather successful and rose to the grade of lieutenant general during First World War. And because he served in the Chevalier Guard, he also was closely connected to the Imperial family. Not least because the mother of Nikolaus II was a Danish princess, Dagmar, and they actually then communicated in Scandinavian language, which had some also positive impact on his career. But one could really call Mannerheim an imperialist. Up until the Russian Revolution, he didn't really see, or at least not believe, that Finland could, develop into an independent nation. And actually, it would have been very difficult for Finland to develop into an independent nation as long as the Imperial Russia existed. So it was, in a way, a lucky coincidence that happened then in 1970. Now, then Mannerheim took part first, of course, on the Russian side in First World War, but due to the revolution, he then was able to return to Finland and led the counter-revolution against the Finnish revolutionaries. And then had also a political role in 1990 and returned actually then when Second World War broke out in the age of 72. He was again named commander-in-chief and continued up until the end of that war. When we discuss what really formed Mannerheim's life in geopolitics, I very much like the subtitle that the publisher, because I had wanted actually to have in the main title something about geopolitics, but the publisher said, or the editor said, no one knows Mannerheim on other side of the globe. We need to have his name and what he was, Marshal of Finland. Okay. But the subtitle is important, A Life in Geopolitics, because of, by coincidence one could say, he really, during his lifetime, beginning as a cavalry officer and ending as a president in 80s, and ending then President of the Republic of Finland when the first atom bomb had been, exploded. So it was truly, an amazingly long and dramatic lifetime during which the geopolitics many times really changed. After Russians' loss in the Russian-Japanese War, in which Mannerheim had taken part as voluntary, he went out as voluntary because his marriage had crashed, and also his brothers, who were legalists and constitutionalists, who really tried to fight against Russification program in Finland. Mannerheim was not very much engaged in that and actually saw that it was not his business. He was focusing on his career. He was a typical Streber. But at the same time also he learned all the way about geopolitics, and I claim that the most important existential experience was when he was sent out for an espionage expedition in 1906, 14,000 kilometers through Central Asia to sort out how well the Chinese were prepared for the next war. Were there any Japanese engineers or military advisors there among them, or what was happening? So actually it was a journey that took him almost 2 years. And it was really life-threatening, one could say. A number of his assistants lost their lives, and his health was partly in very bad shape. But after he had returned from that trip, and after have written a very analytical summary of what we had seen, it was actually camouflaged as a scientific expedition. So he took a lot of photos and did some ethnographic measuring of the ethnographic population there. He wrote a report in which he recommended that during the next war it would be suitable for Russia to invade northern Central Europe, Central Asia, so that Urumqi was especially, Urumqi, as you know, is now today also mentioned because of the Chinese treatment of the population there. But Urumqi and those regions could be good to occupy in order to have a, so to say, trump card in the peace negotiations with China. So this kind of expanding geopolitical understanding of this trip was considerable. The next, so to say, geopolitical, so to say, expansion or true experience for Mannerheim was not really the breakout of First World War. He took part as a front commander first in Poland and then in the Romanian front. But when the revolution then broke out, first the February Revolution, and then the chaos in the Russian Empire during spring and summer 1917, he was wise enough to then arrange for himself a treatment, medical treatment in Odessa, and waiting for how the chaos in the Russian Empire would develop. And as you know, then came the Bolshevik Revolution when Mannerheim was in Odessa up until actually December 1917. And then he traveled through the revolutionary Russia to Helsinki and was there then appointed as commander-in-chief of the then already independent Finland, because the Finland had declared its independence in December 1970 as a direct consequence of the October Revolution. In history writing, earlier one, it was claimed that Mannerheim returned to Finland to defend, in first place, the independent Finland. But my interpretation is that that was, of course, something that he had noticed, but in the situation of winter 1917-1918, it was not at all clear or obvious or sure that Finland could maintain its independence. So from Mannerheim's point of view, I have come to the conclusion that for him, his point of view, it was more a question of counter-revolution, to fight the Bolshevik power in Petrograd. Actually, the Russian Revolution, the most active sort of phase in that revolution began in Helsinki, not in Petrograd, but in Helsinki. There were more, fierce fighting in Finland than in Petrograd in winter 1917-1918. And the reason was that a considerable part of the Baltic fleet was throughout the war in Helsinki. So there was some politically emancipated seamen in Helsinki that the Bolsheviks understood that were, so to say, avant-garde of the revolution. The war ended anyhow in the victory of the Whites, but it was complicated for Mannerheim because the Finnish government had called for German help. So the German troops actually liberated Helsinki, not Mannerheim. And directly after the Whites had won the war, the Germans dictated that Mannerheim has to leave. So it was only after the German capitulation November 1918 that Mannerheim then could return. Mannerheim was clearly Entente-minded. For obvious reasons, if thinking about his background, but also because he was convinced that Germany was going to lose the war, and it was not wise for Finland to join the German front. Then, on the other hand, many Finnish politicians thought that the war against the revolutions would have been lost without the German help, and I would claim that was actually the truth. In Mannerheim's memoirs that were published in 1950s, he doesn't, of course, emphasize this part of the story. But the, so to say, attitude towards Mannerheim, also among the whites, the bourgeoisie, was complicated because of his Russian background. Was he a true, so to say, man, in favor of independence, or was his motive to restore the Imperial Russia? So actually, up until Second War, younger Finnish non-socialist politicians, many call him the old Russian officer. That was, the unofficial attitude amongst many. But of course, by most Finnish non-socialists, he was a hero. This is something I want to emphasize to you, that the story and the narrative of Mannerheim is more complicated, that he's the hero for all Finns. Even less, of course, among Russians. You see here, you see the front line. The weaker one is in 1917, and the more black is in spring 1918. And the turning point in the war in Finland was actually the peace treaty between the Bolsheviks and the Germans in Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Because in that treaty, the Bolsheviks promised to withdraw their troops from Finland, and then the Reds in Finland had lost their not so much the army support, but the weaponry support. That was, of course, crucial. Mannerheim's, so to say, influence on Finnish politics was short. He returned as I said, to politics in late 1918 and was then called to function as regent of Finland up until we got a constitution that we got in summer 1990. But he lost in the first presidential election and lived a comfortable life as a private man, an aristocrat. The Finnish the audience, the public, then collected a large sum of money, and he could then live on that capital, what the capital had produced. But they did not let him to use the capital itself because he was not very good in treating. He had excellent taste and a man of some expensive hobbies, so to say, but he was not good in treating, capital. That was how also his wife, fortune was lost, to put it shortly, and during the Russian era. So the arrangement was that he could then, with the output of the capital, live a good life. And that was what most Finns thought. But in the 1930s, then, after Hitler had gained power, and Mannerheim still was in very good condition, he was in a way returning to geopolitics, functioning as advisor and a chairman of a Finnish military committee that gave recommendations to Finnish government what kind of preparation for war should be arranged. And actually then, when the Winter War broke out, he was again called to function as a commander-in-chief. Now, what happened in the late 1930s was that Mannerheim saw that the big war would break out sooner than later, actually, and that Finland has to be prepared. And as understanding the Russian, so to say, interest, geopolitical interests, security interests. He understood that if nothing is done, Finland will be, obviously threatened by a war between Russia and Germany. So he tried actually to find a kind of a solution together with Sweden and Soviet Union. Even he was first anti-Bolshevik. He understood that if this kind of arrangement could be found, a German, so to say, attempt to attack Leningrad through the Finnish Gulf would be difficult. So the idea was to remilitarize the Åland Islands that had been demilitarized since the Crimean War, 1856. But the Swedes would not join this arrangement because Soviet Union demanded some islands along at the Finnish Gulf. But Mannerheim thought that was not a good idea because Finland did not do anything with islands, but not the Finnish government, because the anti-Russian atmosphere and feelings were very strong in Finland. Not an inch could be given up to the Bolsheviks was the idea. So the Winter War broke out. Finland was able to avoid an occupation of the country. There were many reasons for that. Of course, Finns were strongly motivated, but Stalin had killed a lot of his leading generals, and the Russian army was also otherwise badly prepared. And then, thank God, we had a very cold winter. So if you have a kind of a home advantage, so to say, to use sport terms. If you fight on your own ground, you know where to find the corners and how to. That is why the Russians were not able. There are some obvious similarities between the Winter War and the early stage of the Ukrainian War. Let's see how the war continues there. It's of course much longer because the Winter War continued only for 3 months. The reason why Stalin then decided to sign a peace treaty was that he got wrong information, that the Churchill's plans to occupy the Swedish iron ores fields in northern Sweden, and that was camouflaged as a military help to Finland, was something that Stalin thought actually that would drag Soviet Union in a war against also Great Britain and France. And also there was some information about the British Air Force bombarding Baku, which was crucial for not only for Soviet Union but also for Germany. You have to remember that Germany and Soviet Union were allies at that stage. But this map actually then describes the situation Finland was in after Winter War. In summer 1940, Denmark and Norway were occupied by Germany, and the Baltic states were occupied by Soviet Union. The Soviet Union began also to sharpen its demands of how Finland should, deliver, and also let the Soviet Union take a control of the nickel mines up in the north and in Petsamo. You have it. Let's see. Yeah. I don't see the cursor, but anyhow, it's by the IC. In that very situation again, which is actually connected to the British, warfare, because Hitler was not able to invade Great Britain in the Battle of Britain. Hitler turned his eyes on Soviet Union, decided and let the Great Britain be and occupy and crush Soviet Union. And that was a decision he took already in July 1940 and sent immediately envoy to Helsinki and asked, if we deliver to you, to Finland, weaponry, how long can you last? Or not, no. He asked, how long would you last if the Soviet Union would occupy Finland, try to attack Finland? For 3 months, Mannerheim said. And then Hitler understood that Finland would, whatever happens, would fight Soviet Union. And 1 month later, then Germany and Finland had an agreement that Germany would sell weaponry to Finland, and German troops could be transported through Finland from northern Norway. Also very much other necessities were bought now from Germany, had during the summer become the first most important trade companion for Finland, because the trade with Great Britain was impossible, and Finland was really in a way forced to choose side. Would it try to remain neutral as Sweden, or actually then join the German attack against Soviet Union? And in December 1940, Finland was offered this. Choose. Either you choose and take part in our attack against Soviet Union, or you lose your independence. And the choice was difficult, but at that stage there was not really an alternative, because if Finland would not have joined the Operation Barbarossa, the land would have been occupied by either Soviet Union or actually by both Germany. Germany would have occupied northern Finland because they needed the nickel mines, and Soviet Union southern Finland because they wanted to strengthen the security of Leningrad. So Finland joined then Operation Barbarossa, and after some delay it began its offensive, and it actually, you see from the map that the Finnish troops advanced up until the big lake of Onega, not only to Ladoga but to Onega. That was something that the Finns and the Germans had agreed about already in January 1941. We had a war guilt trials in Finland 1945, 46, and 8 Finnish politicians were then accused for this alliance with Germany. Nobody remember anything of that because it was not Finns did not document anything of this, and the Finnish negotiators said we cannot sign any kind of treaty because that would spoil our relationship not only to Scandinavia but also to the Anglo-American world. But in fact it was a military treaty, military alliance. That has been since the end of Second World War a kind of one of the big issues in Finnish historiography. The politicians denied, of course, that. Also the military specialists and also historians took actively part in describing the war as a separate war. That was the, so to say, the how it was called. But not, of course, when Finns communicate with the Germans. But in fact, Germany financed the Finnish warfare, not only the army, but also the home front. Finland was actually the only country that could, get all this without paying it in advance. So when the Finns broke up with the Germans in September 1944, a huge debt to Germany was still in place. But that was transformed into a debt to Soviet Union, together with a big war repair that had to be paid. Now, Mannerheim's role in this all was more a kind of a geopolitician than a military leader. You have to remember that he had actually his general staff education was not on so to say official. He had never actually passed the general staff education in Russia. Of course, he had got some, practical, knowledge about it. But during the Second World War, his role in Finnish politics was actually his idea about how to advance and how to balance between Soviet Union and Germany, and in the end it was successful, although Finland again lost the Karelia and 100,000 Finns lost their lives as soldiers. But actually only 2,000 civilians lost their life in Finland. So that's really a very different story from, for example, Estonia, where in Estonia, the large majority of all people that lost their lives, and also in Poland, in Ukraine, and Belarus, were civilians. It has been estimated that 54 million Europeans lost their lives, and of them, 27 million were civilians. So that's why actually the Finns have still a pretty strong belief in that conscription army can make the difference. After Cold War had ended, many Europeans thought that we don't need any more conscription army. In Finland, we have thought it differently. And that is, of course, because we have an eastern neighbor that is unpredictable, and even more today, as you know. This is a map of Cold War Europe, and you see the geographical position of Finland. In a way, Finland was in the pocket of the Warsaw Pact. In Finland, we used to talk about Eastern Europe and not meaning Finland. But if you look at the map, most of what we call Eastern Europe is westwards from Finland. East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and so forth. So it was very much an ideological kind of thinking that we spoke and still tend to speak about East Europe. Mannerheim then resigned as president in 1946, and then together with his ghost writers produced his memoirs that were also published in English. And those memoirs were written in a situation where NATO had been just established, and Finland had also signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, the so-called Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Support, that obliged Finland to defend its territory against any kind of attack against Soviet through Finland. Even if Finland was claiming that it was a neutral country, and you see from this map, it is in a way the white, so to say, part of it, it had to oblige to this treaty up until 1992. This treaty was in power up until 1992. And only 2 months later, Finland then applied for EU membership. So everything then suddenly happened in 1992. The legacy of Mannerheim, as I said already, one very strong one is that the conscription army can make the difference if you have a kind of if you fight in a landscape that you know better than your enemy. But of course, another legacy was a certain kind of pragmatism, a kind of one can even claim a sarcastic realism, that the understanding that it's not necessary so that, and especially not during the Cold War, that anyone would come to Finland's help if the question was only about the independence of Finland. And has it now differed when Finland have joined the NATO? Maybe. Let's hope. But if great European war would break out, many other nations in Europe would also be threatened, that don't have an army of their own, that rely totally on United States. Finland is, of course, now deepening very strongly and systematically its cooperation with Great Britain and United States, but we cannot really be sure that in all situations the help will come, and therefore we will maintain our conscription army. Thank you.
I think you can all agree that that was a magisterial presentation. Thank you so much. It did exactly what we were hoping in giving lines of thinking into both the man, but also on the stamp, it turns out, and the politics and geopolitics of the time. I'm going to kick off with just a couple of questions, but can you be thinking what questions you'd like to raise, and I'll go right through. My first question is slightly off the stream of what you said. Here was this individual, you described his role, who from an early age really played a very big role in the future of Finland. What were his personal characteristics which took him to this? Was he a very authoritarian individual? Was he a very clever man? Was he strategic? Was he ambitious? Why was it that this particular individual was able to play the very, very big role that you've described over such an interesting period of Finnish history and world history?
Of course, all those characteristics were important, but I would say that he was of course intelligent, but I wouldn't say that he was kind of a genius, but he was, one could call him a smart person that was able to avoid, even if he was thrown into difficult situations, both in his private life, but also in his career, to avoid catastrophes. And so this kind of interesting way to be able to cope in different situations and come back. I mean, because when he returned to Finland in 1917, he had lost everything he had. And so his career was, was not at all sure that he could continue as an officer. But then, of course, I would say that he had, it might sound a bit kind of old-fashioned, but I would say that he had a very strong character, kind of will force. He spoke with one of his close generals, and especially after the Winter War, who said that it's very important to have a kind of the will force is very important. And of course, he was a person that really did not fit in the democratic Republican Finland. Yeah, thinking about his background. But then again, learned also to communicate with the politicians. So the Social Democrats that in 1918 had begun the revolution accepted him in late 1930s because of his tries to find a kind of solution, a peaceful solution also with Soviet Union. But of course, it's difficult to there are different descriptions of his personality. Those who admired him emphasize his, kind of human part of the characters. Those who then were critical towards him emphasized the opposite. But I would say that a very strong part of his character was, in a way, his resilience that I claim actually the trip through Asia was the existential experience for him. After that, because during the Second War, actually, when he met his friends during the evenings, they spoke not so much about the war, but he told them stories from Asia.
So that 2 years was important in his character. My second question, then I'll come to questions more widely, is about the period you were talking about, 1920 to 1939. That's, of course, a massively interesting period of European history, where many of the people caught between Russia on the one hand and Germany on the other in the different countries were varying in different ways. Could you just talk a little bit more about his role at the time? How was he spending his time? What was he doing? To what extent was he involved in the governance of Finland in facing up to the various personal and strategic choices which arose during that period?
Yes. As I said, he lost the presidential election in summer 1919, and then there was, of course, strong suspicion against him among the socialist parties, but also among agrarian league politicians, because they suspected that he had still a so-called Russian interest, and that he was more interested in restoring the Russian Empire than defending the Finnish independence. But he lived, typical aristocratic, very comfortable life in 1920s. He bought a villa in the fashionable quarters of Helsinki. You know, he was still riding and hunting big game also, and bought a villa along the Finnish southwest coast, and reached the age of 60 and actually went twice to British India to hunt tigers. So in his home that now is a museum, there is a tiger that at that time he shot it in spring 1937. One of the largest. It was Maharaja of Nepal that let him shoot that tiger. That was in a way his private life. He took part also in some humanitarian and social activities. But as I said, in the 1930s, he was then in a way called back as an advisor. But there was, of course, an interesting situation in very early 1930s. We had a right radical, a right populist movement that took inspiration from Italy and Germany, that tried to overthrow the democratic constitution, and he was in a way he didn't want to lead this kind of movement, even if they had wanted him to join in, because he had learned his lesson, so to say, that domestic politics was not for him. But it's obvious that he was skeptical towards parliamentary democracy. That was not really his worldview. That is obvious. But with that, I don't say that he was a right radical, more a kind of typical aristocratic reactionary. But then in the 30s, then there was a kind of circle of geopolitically thinking, understanding Finnish politicians that began to discuss what to do if a world war would break out again. And one of the closest persons that took part in these discussions were actually Juho Kusti Paasikivi, who actually was the successor of Mannerheim in 1946 and functioned 10 years as Finnish president. And in Finland we talked during Cold War the Paasikivi-Kekkonen line. And that meant that the kind of real politic idea about that Finland has to take in account the Russian security interest, especially concerning Leningrad. Now, Paasikivi was not either a socialist, he was a conservative, but had a kind of very harsh, realistic view about what small countries can do in geopolitics. And there was a number of other also politicians that discussed and tried to then change the Finnish, so to say, very strict neutrality policy within the League of Nations. That really was something one I thought was a waste of time. And it clearly was.
A lot to think about. Now, I've already seen 2 or 3 people want to come in. I'm just going to go round, and more than that. Actually, I was going to go round in ones, but I'm wondering if I'll go round in twos. So I'm going to ask questions in twos and ask you to respond to both questions, because I'm glad there's a lot of questions. First of all, can you just introduce yourself first as you ask your question?
Hubertus Jahn, Professor of History of Russia and the Caucasus. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and having been in Finland a lot of times, can really relate to what you said. I have one quick question and a bit of a larger one. The first is, did Mannerheim keep any contacts in the Russian emigration? In other words, from his former officer buddies? And the second, and that's the more complex one, in 1939, how much to his advantage was his knowledge of Russian strategy? Strategy. Because, I mean, having served for 30 years, one could assume that he would guess at least what's going to happen in this war. Because this is, of course, something which you see in the current war, where the Ukrainians are obviously also knowledgeable of what the Russians think.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to go round this way, but I promise I'll get to absolutely everybody. So next, the gentleman there. As I said earlier, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Sakari Mesimäki. I'm a PhD student here at Cambridge, but my interest in the topic is more from being Finnish. And I understand Mannerheim he's a national icon, but I'd be very much interested hearing a bit more about what his relationship was to Finland and how that transformed. It seemed he kind of at least started off as, a cosmopolitan aristocrat, imperialist who wasn't very bothered with, Russification, was more sort of anti-Bolshevik in the Civil War. And I remember reading that, in the wars that followed, he was actually quite sort of surprised at how well Finland did and didn't have originally a very high opinion of, Finnish soldiers. And,
You mean in 1939 or?
Yes, I don't remember very well. That might be wrong. But, for example, by the time he was president, was he then a sort of patriotic Finn, or was he sort of a consistent, sarcastic realist all the way through?
Thank you. Can you deal with that?
Yeah. The first question, did Mannerheim keep contact with exiled Russians? Yes, he did, very much so. Both in Russian language, but also in French. There was a number of exiled Russians that first they flew to Finland, but from most of them then continued to the continent and to France especially. But he also corresponded pretty much with them, and during Second World War also he, emphasized for one of those of his friends that the war against Soviet Union was not a war against the Russian people, but against that this was the last chance for the Western civilization to crush the Bolsheviks. And also, during 1918, 1919, he had close, contact with the white Russian generals, but because he could not get from them a promise that they could accept Finnish independence, he would not then join them in the war against the revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks. And some people have said that was actually really decisive, because the Bolsheviks were in summer 1919 could have been crushed. That is, I think it was at that stage the capital was moved from Petrograd to Moscow. So that was something he up until his death he kept comparing. The knowledge of Russian geopolitics, of course, it actually, because he had for obvious reasons, the Finnish Gulf was of crucial importance for Russia. Even if the capital had been moved to Moscow, it is still the second largest city in Russia. And the Russian-European contacts very much went through Leningrad, especially during the Interwar period, because the Baltic states were independent. So this played a crucial role, and so his advices and demands during the second part of 1930s were rooted in this understanding. So he truly had an understanding. And also when he was president of Finland between 1944 and 1946, he also tried to reach a kind of solution that would also satisfy the Russians. They got a navy base 30 kilometers westward from Helsinki and kept that up until 1955. Now, Mannerheim's attitude towards Finland, that was the question. Of course, he was of course a patriot. He was born in Finland, but that did not mean that he then thought that the Finnish, so to say, autonomy or development westwards was in line with what the Russian Empire required, was best for the Russian Empire. If you do a career in an army, you can be a patriot at the same time. His brothers actually demanded him to resign in the beginning of the Russian-Japanese War. But he had just divorced and had lost his fortunes. So he replied to his brothers that as an officer, you cannot really, act like depending on political, changes, so that you have to really think in longer run, and it wouldn't help in any way Finland if he would resign. But I have then interpreted this also as that was actually also his priorities. His priorities was more the empire and his own career, and he didn't really believe that Finland could develop into an independent country. And that was actually the case with most Finns at that stage. There was only a few activists that thought in 1904 that how on earth could Finland ever become independent when there were stronghold and a lot of Russian troops in Finland. But then, of course, during the Russian Revolution, it's more difficult to say how he saw the people. I actually have drawn the conclusion that he took in those years between 1917 and 1922, maybe also up until mid-20s, that he was not sure that actually he was one of those who thought that the Bolshevik story would be short. But how much he really trusted the Finnish independence, there's not any clear evidence of that was his first priority. I don't say that he wished that the Russian Empire would be restored, but on the other hand, there is not evidence of that he would have not, some Finnish politicians said that if the Russian Empire would be restored, Mannerheim would directly leave to St. Petersburg.
Good thought. Okay, next to 1-2. Molly there. I thought you'd make fun, Brendan.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Thank you for the biography, which I hugely enjoyed. I've got two questions. One is to do with your geopolitical framing, which I find entirely persuasive. But it seems to me as if Mannerheim really made two big calls during his career. One of them he got right, which, as you say, in the First World War, or towards the end of the First World War, he was clear that the Allies would win, even at a time when the Germans seemed to be on the march, and that was very important for the future of Finland in 1918, 1919. But then he makes first the right call at the beginning in 1939, if I understand your text correctly, but then he thinks after the fall of France that actually Germany will win, and that, of course, was wrong. So my question there is, I wonder whether there wasn't more room for maneuver for Finland in, let's say, late 1940, early 1941. I mean, if they had simply said, actually, we won't join your war, to Hitler. Or to put it differently, had Mannerheim known, had he been certain, even after the fall of France and the fall of Denmark and Norway, that the Allies would win the war, would he have done something differently? Would he perhaps not have entered the war against the Soviet Union? So that's one question. The other question, very quickly, is to do with his attitude towards the Jews. And because normally, particularly in that part of the world, if people who are very preoccupied with Bolshevism also are quite strongly anti-Semitic, particularly with that sort of social background and obviously being a Tsarist officer. So what was his attitude towards Jews, and what happened to the Jews within his area of control during the Second World War?
Yes. This is, the question of that could the Allies win the war. And we have to remember 1940, there was not still the Allied forces, but there was only the Western forces, because the ally between Soviet Union and Great Britain was only, born after the war had begun. But Mannerheim admitted to Paasikivi when they discussed the war in autumn '44 in grim situation. They admitted that it was a kind of risk that was taken in 1941. That he clearly understood that there was a risk that Germany would also this time lose the war, and he had not become more pro-German in any way. But this was kind of, as far as I have been able to interpret the situation, a risk that was necessary, because even if the Allies would win the war in the end, a byproduct of that might be that Soviet Union would occupy Finland, which was also pretty close to it. I mean, if Finland would not have got the German support, Finland would clearly have, Soviet Union would have occupied Finland in order to defend Leningrad, because Leningrad was, of course, Finnish troops were very close to Leningrad on northern side, and the German troops then, it's a question of definition, that did Finland take part in the, what do you call it, in serenation, what do you call it when you surround? Blockade of Leningrad. The Finns have claimed that Finland did not take part of it. But of course Finland, you know, in passive way took part in the blockade. But if that would not have been the case, there's no reason to believe that Stalin would have respected Finnish independence. There's no evidence of that this was how he thought, but this is my conclusion of that is his probable way to discuss it, because Paasikivi, that then wrote his memoirs, and in some of his descriptions of Mannerheim were not very flattering. He still admitted that Mannerheim been, you know, had understood the grave situation Finland was in when both Finland was surrounded by the dictators. So my conclusion in other ways that he would have anyhow have taken that step. Together with the President of Finland, it was not even, the government of Finland was not informed, probably up until just some weeks before the war broke out. Now about the Jews. Now Mannerheim served in his early career in 1890s in Poland, where there was very strong anti-Semite feelings, and there are some letters to his relatives that are not very admiring towards the Jews, but later on there are no signs of anti-Semitic attitudes, and during the war Finland was able to not a single Finnish citizen of Jewish faith was sent to Germany, not a single. There was 8 refugees from Austria that were sent back to Germany, and they lost their lives, and also some Soviet prisoners of war. Among them there were also Jews. I think there were 50 of Finland and Germany exchanged prisoners in war, prisoners of war, and of them like 50 of those were of Jewish origin, and pretty many of them were actually were of the Soviet security service. So I think like a third of them were then employed by Gestapo actually. But they lost their lives because of the exchange of prisoners. But the Finnish community, the Jewish community in Finland took part in the war. So there was a number of Finnish Jews that could have been decorated with Iron Cross, but for understandable reason didn't want to take it. And in December 1944, Mannerheim took then part in the Jewish congregation in memory of the fallen Jewish soldiers.
Thank you. Okay, I've got lots of people. Excellent. I'm going to go from the back. So you're right at the back, and then the next one. So these two.
Hi, my name's Edward Owens. I'm a part-time graduate student here at Cambridge. My question is, in the current difficult geopolitical situation now, you talk about Mannerheim and his current or his difficult geopolitical situation, is the political elite in Finland evoking Mannerheim and what he might have done? And if so, what are they saying about him?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Christian. I'm actually Estonian with a background in international relations. My question was, from your research, how much credence do you think Mannerheim gave to the concept of Suur Suomi, which is the idea of a greater Finland, essentially sort of stretching to the White Sea, which is kind of encompassing the traditional Finnic land, so to speak.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Mannerheim's legacy and how much the Finnish government and head of the state are referring to Mannerheim, not actively, because it can easily be then understood as kind of too, it's not really the right political style, but of course they are reading, at least when they are elected president, they try to learn something about actually the Finnish constitution is that it is direct election of the president. That means that they are not necessarily specialists on security policy, to put it that way. So they don't refer clearly to Mannerheim. But of course, this kind of understanding of Finland's geopolitical position is partly, is a continuation of Mannerheim's thinking. And of course, our army has, throughout the years, kept, held Mannerheim as their, so to say, figurehead throughout Cold War. Even if Mannerheim lost some of his aura during that, among the military officers, he has always been the hero number one. And now they are, of course, very pleased that Finland have joined the NATO. Also, most of us other Finns as well. So not really. Then the other question about Suur-Suomi, that in spring 1941, the German government or foreign office sent to the Finnish head of the state a request that Finland should inform them that how big part of Russia would Finland like to have. So a Finnish historian and a geographer then wrote a book that then were able to show that both for botanic and geological and historical and ethnographic reasons, the East Karelia up until to the White Sea, for natural reason, belonged to Finland, and this was then something that was not an official, so to say, thing said, and Mannerheim then published a kind of order of day. I think that's the so to say. Mannerheim did not speak on radio, and he was not like Churchill or Hitler, orator. But he then wrote the orders of the day, in which there was one order of the day in early July 1941, in which he describes the future of the larger Finland. He's now, opening for us, and he was heavily criticized for that, especially after the war. But how much he then really believed in that is another question. He, under no condition, he wanted Finland to join the invasion of Leningrad. That was something that Finland should never take part in, because that would only, cause some bitterness and revenge feeling among the Russians, which was very true. The reason why, of course, why the army then advanced so much eastwards was that was an agreement with the Germans, that Leningrad should be surrounded, and the Germans should come from south and Finland from the north. And there were some promises also to the front soldiers that when the peace would come, there would be land to deliver to them. So, but personally, Mannerheim was not very interested in the huge, areas on East Karelia.
As I recall as well, didn't Mannerheim actually disobey an order from Hitler, I think, to go beyond Leningrad or something, to sort of partake further in Barbarossa?
Yeah, Hitler could actually not give orders.
Right, my mistake, but rather the sort of, diplomatic request.
Yes, it's true. The Germans tried to get Finland more actively involved in the war against Leningrad, but Mannerheim claimed that too many lives were already lost and we didn't have the the artillery to attack it. But also he communicated with Churchill in autumn 41. Churchill demanded that the railway from Murmansk to Russia, other parts of it should be spared, and otherwise Great Britain would declare Finland war. But Mannerheim could not promise him that, because that information would directly go to Stalin. So it was in a way also discussed then in the war guilt trial. But in the war guilt trial, Mannerheim was not accused. He was, in a way, avoided that, which was, of course, something he was criticized for.
Thank you. Next questions, 1, 2.
Thank you. Donatas Kupčiūnas, Center for Geopolitics. I was just wondering, what was Mannerheim's attitude towards Józef Pilsudski's grand geopolitical designs after the First World War? Because Józef Pilsudski and the Poles, federalist-minded Poles, wanted to create this block of states stretching from Finland in the north to the Black Sea in the south. I would assume that Mannerheim and Finns in general were kind of skeptical about that, because they saw the 3 Baltic states and even perhaps Poland as almost like seasonal states, and saw them more like a liability than an asset. But I would be interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't know how this works.
No, it's fine.
Oh, okay, you can hear me. Yeah, well, back in 1918...
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. My name is Daniel Austin. I lived in Finland in the 1980s and early 90s. And back in 1989, I actually lived with a Second World War Jewish Finnish war veteran who proudly showed me his Iron Cross. I can't remember what class it was, first or second, but he actually fought alongside German soldiers, and he was very proud of defending Finland. And in the synagogue, I saw the wreath that Marshal Mannerheim presented to the Jewish community. But my question really concerns his time in Poland. I mean, I guess with all the travels he did, he must have, formed quite a cosmopolitan view of the world. And I don't know if you know my friend, Professor Rt Yes. He's written extensively on Mannerheim's time in Poland. Poland and Finland share the same geopolitical outlook, strategic outlook, vis-a-vis Russia and the Baltic. I just want to know whether in your book you write extensively about his time in Poland, or have taken stuff from Jarek's writing on his formative years in Poland as a Tsarist officer.
Thank you. 2 questions.
Yes, Pilsudski first. Yes, you are right that the attitude. There was an idea to establish, as you said, a kind of alliance between those buffer zones, Finland and Baltic countries and Poland. But there was a number of also kind of conflicts also between those countries, not least between Lithuania and Poland, that complicated it. And also because there was the interests of Finland and Poland were not, really, in line with each other. So it was. You have to remember, at that situation, Mannerheim was not anymore in charge. He was kind of private man. But he met Pilsudski a number of times, and he was able, actually, as you another question concerning Mannerheim's years in Poland. He was between 1909 and 1940. He served in Warsaw, and lived. Actually, in his memoirs, he remembered those years as his happiest years in his life, because that was the old regime, so to say, in Europe before First World War. He rose to the rank of general, and the Polish aristocracy treated him as an equal, not as a Russian, even if they were very cautious not to discuss Russian issues with him, because they could not really know how he would react. And they knew that his older brother was one of the opponents, political opposition against Russification program in Finland. But I have not really built so much on Dr. Jaroslav Suhople's writings on those years, but Jaroslav Suhople's PhD thesis. Actually, I was one of the pre-evaluators of that. Yes.
I think he did it for Matti Klinger.
Yes. So it's interesting because it had to do with how Great Britain and United States then the Finnish sovereignty was then in Paris during the Paris Treaty, Versailles negotiations was then recognized. So that was his. But I would say that the Warsaw years were for Mannheim in a way his home. All his furnitures most of his furnitures that he has in his home in Helsinki are from his Warsaw home, and they were unspoiled. He could, transport them home after First World War, even if the armies had number of times, marched through Warsaw. So it was. But I know that in Poland there is an interest in Mannheim. There's many Poles think that Mannheim was like Pilsudski, but there is again also differences.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? I'll take you, but can I see if there are others coming round? Just think about it. Okay, I'll go 1, 2.
So Václav Slezak, work for the civil service. Can I ask you about one particular question which interests me most? The deportations of Finns into Russia, Siberia, and the transportation of Russians into Finland. If you look at Estonia, how that how the population was decimated by the Russification. So I'm just interested in deportations in one way and then replacement. And did those Russians who went into Finland, did they become Finns or did they go back? What happened to them?
Hang on a second. I'll take the second question then, if you can deal with both of them. So.
Thank you. My name is Justin. I just have an interest in many of these areas. I was reading recently some memoirs of a British general who'd been in Poland after the First World War with Pilsudski and all that bunch. And he made a reference to Mannerheim being involved in weapons dealing. Is that something that is familiar to you?
Weapons dealing?
Selling weapons, selling and buying arms.
With Poland or with...
In Poland.
Okay. Yes, the first question was a deportation of Finns. Now, actually, when Finland had to, in the treaty, peace treaty in March 1940, no Finns were left in those territories that Soviet Union took over. Not a single, all the Finns were evacuated because the Finnish government understood what would happen with them if they would be left there in the Soviet territory. So there was no deportation of Finns during that war, but there was a number of Finnish communists that had went over to Soviet Union in 1920s and 30s, and they had a harsh, destiny because they were most of them were, murdered during the Stalin process in 1930s. Now then, there was 64,000 Soviet prisoners of war during the so-called continuation war between 1941 and 44. And of them, 1/3 died during the first winter 41-42 because of not enough nourishing and a number of also there was a lot of also sickness among them, but the rest of them were 40,000. Half of them were sent out to countryside to workforce, but all of them had to be returned after the war to Soviet Union, and also 60,000 Ingrian, civilians that had been, Soviet citizens that the area that the Germans had occupied in 41, those civilians were then transported to Finland in 1943. All of them, most of them, had to also to be returned to the Soviet Union in 44. And a number of them were then deported to other parts, so they could not return to their own home regions after the war, but only after Stalin had died. And then the others, no, that was the...
No, the second question was reading about Mannerheim and allegations or suggestions of arms dealing or weapons dealing, and Justin was wondering whether you'd heard of those and had any comment on that.
And that was with Poland, or was it with...
In Poland, yes.
It must... I have not heard about it, no. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? We've got about 5 or 6 minutes. I'd like to just ask one question. One of the big controversies people looking at the Baltic states and Finland is about the events of 1940 and the strong distinction between the way that Finland was able to deal with the Soviet takeover and the way in which Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania dealt with the situation. We were at an event with our colleagues at the University of Turku last week where this was talked about, and as you know there's much discussion within the Baltic states about what was done at that time, whether it was right, wrong or whatever. But whether it was right or wrong, there's a sharp distinction with the way in which the Finnish dealt with that situation, leading of course to the Winter War. I just wondered if you could talk about that and why you think the different approaches arose in the way that they did.
Yes, the difference was, of course, that Finland was not prepared to let the Soviet Union to establish naval bases or even to hand over territories to make some changes in the border, especially in Karelian isthmus. So that was why Stalin decided to attack Finland in late November 1940, whereas the Baltic states were prepared to let the Soviet Union establish bases in their country. Now, one reason, of course, that they had not had the same kind of experience 1918 that they had been able. Okay, they had been able to throw out the Bolsheviks, but it was a much more complicated situation, as many of you know, in 1918, 1920 there. But one also additional reason was that actually the Baltic states feared Germany as much or even more Germany than Soviet Union. It might sound odd, but you have to take in account that the German aristocracy, the big landowners, had lost all their lands in the land reforms in Estonia after First War and the revolution. And there was some concerns, clear concerns in the Baltic states if that the German rule would be recovered, those lands would be lost again to the German landlords. So that also had an impact on the Baltic decisions to let Soviet Union establish bases in their countries. And then in the next stage, they had not the same kind of capacity or the will or experience that the Finns had during the Winter War. The Winter was a harsh experience, but it had also strengthened the Finnish, will to be prepared for a new fight against Soviet Union, and that was not something the Baltic states had, and so it has very much been discussed in Finland. Could Finland avoid the Winter War? Okay, it would have been able to avoid the Winter War, but then the next chapter of that story would have been much more problematic. And as I said before, the civilians suffered hugely in Eastern Europe, Finland being the only exception.
Any other questions anybody would like to raise before we finish? I'll take one more.
Yeah, my name is Michael. I've got a general interest in lots of historical subjects like my friend Justin. So it's just one small point. He became regent just before the introduction of the new constitution, I think you said. But
Yeah.
what was he regent of?
No, he was like Finland. After Germany had capitulated in November 1918, the victorious Western powers demanded that Finland should, get a clear kind of new start, and it was obvious that the man to lead that new start was Mannerheim, that had been clearly critical against the German, so to say, direction and alliance with Germany, and he was also able to convince both London and Paris that Finland could then take a step towards a parliamentarian democracy. We have had kind of democratic elections actually since also voting right for women since 1907. But those parliaments were not able to actually reform the country in any way. So it was only in 1990, then in March 1990, we had our first truly democratic parliamentary election. And that new parliament then decided to write during the era when Mannerheim, as a kind of preliminary regent, during that, so to say, short period, then decided that Finland should have a republican constitution with pretty strong power of the President of the Republic. And Mannerheim was actually the regent that signed that constitution that then led to elections in which he lost.
There's a lesson for all of us there. Henrik, I'd like to really, on behalf of, I'm sure everybody here, to thank you so much. It's been a very powerful, a very illuminating description, both of Mannerheim's life, obviously, but also, as I said earlier, of this whole era of Baltic and European history. We're very, very grateful to you for coming and helping us do it. I think everybody should buy the book, which you can get through your Amazon or whatever process that you operate. And as they say, all good bookshops, but I'm not quite sure how that will extend. But Cambridge is full of good bookshops. But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.